Every great band has a center of gravity, one person whose vision, whose talent, or whose sheer refusal to settle shapes everything around them. Sometimes that person rescues the band from obscurity. Sometimes they rescue it from itself. Here are 10 bands of the 60s and 70s saved by one genius member. Number 10. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Neil Young. Crosby, Stills, and Nash had released their debut album in May 1969 to immediate critical and commercial success. The harmonies, David Crosby's, Stephen Stills's, and Graham Nash's, were extraordinary, and their debut reached number 6 on the Billboard 200. They were invited to perform at Woodstock in August 1969. By any measure, they were already a significant band. The question is what they would have become without the fourth voice. Neil Young joined for the group's second album, Deja Vu, 1970, after Stills invited him. Young had been in a band with Stills before, Buffalo Springfield, the short-lived but critically important folk rock group that produced For What It's Worth, 1967, and the two had a creative history that was productive and often contentious. Young's guitar work and his songwriting were categorically different from what the other three members brought. Harder-edged, more unpredictable, less harmonically polished in a deliberate way. The specific tension Young introduced gave the group an edge it would not otherwise have had. His contributions to Deja Vu and to the subsequent live album 4-Way Street, 1971, were the recordings that gave the group its complexity, the sense that not everyone in the band agreed, that the harmony was earned rather than assumed. His response to the Kent State shootings, Ohio, written and recorded within days of the May 4, 1970 killings, was among the fastest and most direct musical responses to a political event in rock history. Crosby, Stills, and Nash would have made pleasant records without Young. With him, they made essential ones. Young's relationship with the group was intermittent throughout the 1970s. He joined and departed multiple times, insisting on autonomy for his solo career, while periodically returning when the creative terms suited him. This dynamic frustrated the other members but preserved the quality of the recordings, because Young was not willing to dilute his contribution simply to maintain a comfortable group arrangement. The group's commercial peak, Deja Vu reaching number 1 on the Billboard 200 in 1970, the live album 4-Way Street reaching number 1 in 1971, coincided with Young's most active participation. The studio reunion albums of subsequent decades never quite recaptured the specific tension of those early records. Graham Nash has said in various interviews that the group was always more volatile with Young than without him, and that the volatility was inseparable from the quality. Young released Harvest in 1972, one of the best-selling albums of that year. While his involvement with the group continued in parallel, he is still recording and performing. Number 9. The Kinks, Ray Davies. The Kinks formed in London in 1963 with Ray Davies, his brother Dave Davies, Pete Quaife, and Mick Avery. Dave Davies wrote the band's first major hit, You Really Got Me, 1964, with its distorted guitar sound, which was produced by slashing the speaker cone of a small amplifier with a razor blade to create a tone that the available equipment could not otherwise produce. That sound was genuinely groundbreaking. The direction that followed it was entirely Ray Davies. Ray Davies was one of the most specifically English songwriters of the 1960s. While the rest of the British invasion was writing about love and relationships in terms drawn from American rock and soul, Davies was writing about tea, about the English class system, about nostalgia for a pre-industrial England he had never actually lived in, but could imagine with remarkable precision. The Kinks are the Village Green Preservation Society, 1968, which Davies wrote almost entirely alone, is a concept album about preserving everything that England was losing to modernization. Released in the same week as the Beatles' White Album and received with limited commercial attention, but recognized since as one of the most original statements in British rock. Without Ray Davies' singular creative vision, the Kinks would have been remembered as the band that made You Really Got Me. With him, they have a catalog that includes Face to Face, 1966. Something Else by the Kinks, 1967. Village Green, 1968. Arthur, 1969. Muswell Hillbillies, 1971. And Everybody's in Showbiz, 1972. A sustained run of thematically and musically ambitious work that was rarely commercially dominant but has been consistently reassessed upwards since. Dave Davies' distorted guitar had created the sound that launched the band. Ray's writing kept them distinct from everything around them across the following decade. The brothers' relationship was famously difficult, physically and creatively, and the tension between them was one of the recurring themes of Kinks history. Davies received the Order of the British Empire in 2004 and was knighted in 2017, recognitions that acknowledged a body of work that had spent much of its existence underestimated by the commercial mainstream. Number 8. The Who, Pete Townshend. The Who formed in London in 1964 from the remnants of earlier groups, with Roger Daltrey on vocals, Keith Moon on drums, John Entwistle on bass, and Pete Townshend on guitar. Daltrey was the visual and vocal front. Moon was the most theatrical drummer in rock, and Entwistle was one of the most technically accomplished bass players. Townshend was the one who decided what all of that energy would be used for. Townshend conceived and largely wrote Tommy, 1969, the first rock opera, a double album telling the story of a deaf, dumb, and blind boy who becomes a pinball champion and eventually a spiritual leader. The project was unprecedented in rock music and established The Who as an artistic force beyond the commercial constraints of the singles market. The windmill guitar playing, Townshend's arm extending fully on the downstroke, was as theatrical as Moon's drumming and as specific as a signature. Quadrophenia, 1973, followed, another double album concept piece, this one about a young mod in 1965 London, struggling with his identity against the backdrop of the mod versus rocker battles on Brighton Beach. Townshend wrote the entire album and produced it. Between Tommy and Quadrophenia, he had produced two of the most ambitious albums in rock history within 4 years, while simultaneously writing the live material that made The Who one of the most celebrated concert acts of the era. Live at Leeds, 1970, recorded at the University of Leeds in February 1970, is consistently cited as one of the greatest live albums ever made. Without Townshend's creative architecture, his willingness to use the band's considerable musical power in service of ideas rather than simply in service of energy, The Who would have been a memorable singles act and an extraordinary live band. With him, they produced two of the decade's most significant albums and a body of live work that has never been surpassed. Townshend wrote Who's Next, 1971, from the remnants of a more ambitious multimedia project called Lifehouse that proved too complex to complete as originally conceived. The songs salvaged from Lifehouse included Won't Get Fooled Again, Baba O'Reilly, and Behind Blue Eyes, three of the band's most enduring recordings. Entwistle died in June 2002. Moon had died in September 1978. The Who have continued performing in various configurations with Townshend and Daltrey as its core, releasing in 2019, their first studio album in 13 years. Number 7. Creedence Clearwater Revival, John Fogerty. Creedence Clearwater Revival formed in El Cerrito, California in 1967 from a group of musicians who had been playing together since the early 1960s under various names. John Fogerty, his brother Tom Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford made up the band. By any objective measure, the band's history is primarily the story of one person. John Fogerty wrote virtually every song, sang lead on virtually every recording, played lead guitar, and produced the albums. Tom Fogerty, Cook, and Clifford were competent musicians who provided the rhythm section and the backing. John was the engine. Between 1968 and 1972, CCR released 6 studio albums and a series of singles that made them one of the best-selling American bands of the era. Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, Down on the Corner, Have You Ever Seen the Rain, Fortunate Son, Green River. The catalog runs continuously without a gap in quality, and every significant element in it is attributable to John Fogerty. His voice, the specific quality of a white California musician who had absorbed the Delta blues tradition so completely that many listeners assumed CCR was a Southern black band, was one of the most individual sounds in American rock. Tom Fogerty left the band in 1971 following creative tensions with his brother. Tom died in September 1990 from tuberculosis contracted through a blood transfusion during spinal surgery. CCR dissolved in 1972, and the subsequent dispute over the band's name and recordings became one of the more damaging in American music history. Fogerty and Fantasy Records, the band's label, were in litigation for years, and Fogerty was contractually prevented from recording the band's own songs for a period. He was sued by Fantasy Records owner Saul Zaentz for alleged self-plagiarism after a solo recording was found to resemble a CCR song, a case the court dismissed but that demonstrated the specific absurdity of the legal situation he was navigating. Fogerty regained control of his recordings eventually and has continued performing his complete catalog in concert. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with CCR in 1993. Number 6. Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page. Led Zeppelin formed in London in September 1968. Jimmy Page had been a member of the Yardbirds and had acquired the rights to the Yardbirds name when the band dissolved. He assembled Led Zeppelin from those rights. Robert Plant on vocals, John Paul Jones on bass and keyboards, John Bonham on drums, and Page himself on guitar. Page also served as the band's producer for their entire catalog, recording everything at Headley Grange, at studios in London and New York, and occasionally outdoors, with a specific attention to how acoustic spaces shape the sound of the recording. Page's guitar work, the specific combination of blues influence, technical invention, and theatrical gesture, defined the sound of heavy rock for the following decade. The bow-played guitar solo from Led Zeppelin II's Whole Lotta Love, 1969, the acoustic precision of Broomhilda from Led Zeppelin III, 1970, and the multi-tracked acoustic and electric work on Led Zeppelin IV, 1971, all demonstrate a range that most guitarists of the era did not attempt. His production choices, recording Bonham's drums in the entrance hall of Headley Grange to get the specific reverb and distance of the Led Zeppelin IV recordings, were as significant as his guitar work. Plant, Jones, and Bonham were each exceptional musicians. The specific combination assembled by Page produced something beyond what any of them would likely have achieved separately. Bonham died in September 1980, and Led Zeppelin dissolved immediately, a decision that acknowledged that the combination was irreplaceable rather than that the surviving members were unwilling to continue. Page's catalog as a producer and as a guitarist is one of the most significant in the history of rock music, and it was built on the platform of a band he assembled from the wreckage of an earlier one. The specific quality of Page's production is audible across the 8 studio albums Led Zeppelin released between 1969 and 1979. He recorded at a variety of locations chosen for their acoustic properties and brought a producer's ear to every aspect of the sound. The recording of John Bonham's drum performance at Headley Grange for When the Levee Breaks on Led Zeppelin IV, 1971, placing microphones at the bottom of a stairwell to capture the natural reverb of the building, produced one of the most sampled drum sounds in the history of recorded music. Led Zeppelin never played a note with a replacement drummer after Bonham's death. The specific combination Page had assembled was, in his judgment, irreplaceable. Number 5. The Doors, Ray Manzarek. The Doors formed in Los Angeles in 1965 after Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek encountered each other on Venice Beach. Morrison was a film student at UCLA with a notebook of poetry and an extraordinary presence. Manzarek was a trained musician. He had studied at DePaul University and at UCLA's music program, with a specific understanding of how to translate Morrison's raw material into something a band could play. The Doors' sound was built on a structural necessity. They had no bass player. Manzarek played bass lines on a keyboard bass unit with his left hand, while playing the melodic and harmonic material with his right hand simultaneously. This gave the band its specific organ-driven sound, dense, churning, distinctly different from the guitar-bass drum structure of most 1960s rock. The keyboard architecture that Manzarek built gave Morrison's voice a platform that guitar-based accompaniment would not have provided.
Come on, baby, light my fire.
Morrison's voice and presence were the band's public identity. Manzarek's musicianship was the mechanism that made the band work. The specific harmonic language he brought from his classical training, the way he voiced chords, the way he moved between keys, gave the Doors a density and sophistication that most rock bands of the era were not operating at. His left hand playing bass lines on the keyboard bass gave the low-end foundation without which the guitar and drums and voice would have had nothing to anchor them. When Morrison died in Paris in July 1971 at the age of 27, Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore attempted to continue as a trio, releasing 2 albums, Other Voices, 1971, and Full Circle, 1972. Before the recognition that the band's identity was irretrievably linked to Morrison's presence led them to stop, Manzarek maintained the Doors' legacy for decades, organizing tours, reissues, and documentary projects. He died in May 2013 at the age of 74. His specific contribution, a trained musician who understood what an untrained visionary needed and built it for him, is one of the cleaner examples of the dynamic this list is about.
Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game.
Number 4, The Rolling Stones, Keith Richards. Mick Jagger is the Rolling Stones' public face, the stage presence, the voice, the performance, the celebrity. Keith Richards is the musical architecture. The two wrote virtually the entire Stones catalog together starting in the mid-1960s, when their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, locked them in a kitchen and told them they would write a song before he let them out. The writing partnership that resulted produced one of the most sustained catalogs in rock history. Richards' guitar playing is built on an approach that is rhythmically unusual. He often plays rhythm guitar with the low E string removed, which gives his chords a specific open, ringing quality that is immediately identifiable. The open tunings he developed, partly in collaboration with Ry Cooder, gave the Stones' 1970s material its specific sound. Sticky Fingers, 1971, Exile on Main Street, 1972, Goat's Head Soup, 1973, It's Only Rock and Roll, 1974. The riff that opens Jumpin' Jack Flash, 1968. The main figure of Gimme Shelter, 1969. The opening of Start Me Up, 1981. These are Richards' fingerprints. Jagger has occasionally made solo recordings and pursued parallel projects. Richards has said in various contexts that he considers the Stones to be the irreplaceable creative context of his work, and that the specific friction between his musical instincts and Jagger's performance instincts is what produces the quality of their best recordings. The band has continued performing into their 8th decade, with a catalog that runs from 1963 to the present, and with Richards at its musical center throughout. Charlie Watts died in August 2021 at the age of 80. His death was the most significant loss the band had experienced since Brian Jones's death in 1969, and the Stones' subsequent touring with replacement drummers acknowledged that something irreplaceable had been removed. The Stones released Hackney Diamonds, 2023, their first album of original material in 18 years, with Richards and Jagger co-writing as they had since Oldham locked them in a kitchen in 1963. Number 3, Pink Floyd, Roger Waters. Pink Floyd formed in London in 1965 around Syd Barrett's songs, personality, and specific quality of psychedelic invention. When Barrett's deterioration made continuation impossible and David Gilmour was brought in as his replacement in 1968, the band was in a transitional moment without a clear creative direction. Roger Waters became that direction. Waters wrote the narrative for The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, an album organized around the stresses of modern life, with specific sections addressing work, money, time, travel, conflict, aging, and mental illness. The album spent 741 weeks on the Billboard 200, a record that stood for decades. Wish You Were Here, 1975, written largely by Waters as a meditation on Barrett's absence and on the alienation of success, followed. Animals, 1977, a direct adaptation of George Orwell's Animal Farm applied to Thatcherite Britain, followed that. The Wall, 1979, a double album about psychological isolation built around Roger Waters' biographical experience of building defensive barriers between himself and the world, followed that. This run, 4 albums over 6 years, each more ambitious than the last, each organized around a coherent conceptual framework that Waters provided, is one of the most extraordinary in rock history. Gilmour's guitar and voice were essential to the execution. Nick Mason's drumming was the rhythmic foundation. Richard Wright's keyboards gave the recordings their harmonic texture, but the vision that determined what all of those elements were building was Waters's. When he left in 1985, convinced that the band was finished, the remaining members disagreed and continued. The argument about which version was more legitimate occupied the following decades.
All in all, you're just another brick in the wall.
Number 2. Fleetwood Mac, Lindsey Buckingham. Fleetwood Mac had existed since 1967, under the direction of guitarist Peter Green, whose blues-influenced leadership had produced a series of British blues recordings and some commercial success. Green departed in 1970 following a nervous breakdown, and the band spent the early 1970s cycling through lineup changes with limited commercial stability. By 1974, when Mick Fleetwood and John McVie were looking for a new direction, the band was not in a strong position. Mick Fleetwood heard a recording by Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. The duo had released one album together, Buckingham Nicks, 1973, which had not been commercially successful, and asked Buckingham to join as lead guitarist. Buckingham agreed on the condition that Nicks also join. The two arrived as a package. The transformation was immediate. Buckingham's guitar approach, technically unconventional, built on finger-picking techniques he had developed himself, gave the band a sonic character different from anything they had previously produced. His arrangement skills, his production instincts, and his specific understanding of how to build a pop song from an unusual angle were the qualities that made Fleetwood Mac, 1975, and Rumours, 1977, the commercial phenomena they became. Rumours sold over 40 million copies worldwide, spent 31 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200, and won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. It is one of the best-selling albums in the history of recorded music. The emotional material available to the band during the Rumours sessions, both Buckingham and Nicks's relationship, and John and Christine McVie's marriage were dissolving simultaneously, gave the album its specific emotional register. Buckingham organized that material, produced it, and made the production decisions that gave it the specific quality of confessional intimacy at high fidelity. Without Buckingham's arrival in 1974, Fleetwood Mac would most likely be remembered as a British blues act with an interesting early catalog. With him, they are one of the best-selling bands in history. Number 1. The Beach Boys, Brian Wilson. The Beach Boys formed in Hawthorne, California in 1961 with Brian Wilson, his brothers Carl and Dennis Wilson, their cousin Mike Love, and their neighbor Al Jardine. The early records, built around surfing and car racing imagery, were produced and largely written by Brian, who had absorbed the production techniques of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound and the harmonic structures of the Four Freshmen, and was already applying them to a California teenage aesthetic. Brian Wilson's specific genius was harmonic. His ability to hear complex, multi-part vocal arrangements and realize them in the studio was extraordinary, and his production skills expanded rapidly through the early 1960s into something that had no parallel in American pop music. By 1966, while the rest of the band toured without him, he had experienced a panic attack on a flight in December 1964 and stopped touring. He was working on Pet Sounds in the studio with session musicians, building something that was categorically different from anything the rock and pop world had produced. Pet Sounds, 1966, used instruments, bicycle bells, Coca-Cola cans, harpsichords, exotic percussion, orchestral brass, that were not part of the standard rock recording vocabulary. The arrangements were layered in ways that no other producer in pop music was attempting. Paul McCartney has said in various interviews that hearing God Only Knows made him realize something about what pop music could be that he had not previously understood, and that Pet Sounds directly influenced the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967. The artistic conversation between Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper is one of the more consequential exchanges in the history of popular music. Wilson's subsequent breakdown during the recording of Smile, the album he conceived as the follow-up to Pet Sounds, was one of the more catastrophic creative derailments of the decade. The album was shelved in 1967 and not completed until 2004, when Wilson finished it as a solo project. The Beach Boys continued without his creative leadership for the following decades, producing recordings that were commercially successful but artistically limited compared to the peak years. Carl Wilson died from lung cancer in February 1998. Dennis Wilson had drowned in December 1983. Wilson has described his mental health struggles, a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, and decades of auditory hallucinations. In his memoir, I Am Brian Wilson, 2016, and in various interviews, and the specific relationship between the psychological difficulties and the specific quality of what he was hearing in his head. As music is one of the more discussed questions in popular music biography, he is alive and still performing. The work of 1964 to 1966, a period of approximately 2 years in which he produced The Beach Boys Today, Summer Days and Summer Nights, Pet Sounds, and the single Good Vibrations, constitutes one of the most concentrated periods of creative achievement in the history of American music. If any of these sent you back to the records, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more deep dives like this one waiting.